Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, we are at midpoint in this season of Pentecost. And it's called Ordinary Time, but it invites us in our lectionary to think about the ministry of Jesus and how that connects with these ancestral stories, how it connects with the reality of our world today. And the beginning of John's Gospel, it's interesting that the story in the Gospel is also a kind of midpoint in the ministry of Jesus. And there is all the adulation. We've heard in the last couple of weeks about all the successes of healing and the connections with people who are longing for kind of liberation and healing and ease of disease. And the disciples are on this high. People are responding. The crowds are turning out. And the moment today's gospel is, the setting is a synagogue in Capernaum. And Jesus is being asked to expound on the old story of the Exodus and the manna, the bread that God is providing. And there's an interesting reaction to this because it's the first time in this ministry, about three-year ministry, he's halfway through, and the public opinion polls turn against him. They don't like what he's talking about. They find it difficult. And part of it is the image. He's taking an old story. Every Jew carried the photograph inside their wallet of the manna, the bread, the candy floss that in the midst of the desert when they were starving and lost, God somehow provided what they needed for the day. And Jesus takes that story and he talks about himself being the bread that gives life. And he talks about it on those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me and I in them. And it's a kind of cannibalism that his hearers, from a religious perspective, they can't accept it. It's not something that their religion allows for. And so they leave. And it's very interesting, Jesus also opens the other half of that ancient Exodus story. The other half of that story is that even though God is taking care of them, the people grumble. They're complaining against Moses. This is too hard. We don't have enough to eat. We'd rather be back in Egypt making bricks. Our life is secure. We know our place in the world. And they blame Moses and so on. And it's interesting that there's a kind of moment that Jesus realizes the connection of being the bread of life and the grumbling against him is a sign that he's on track. He's right on track. That this is not a new story. Why is he surprised? And there is this gap between you are the Holy One of God and the one who's going to betray him. You know, there is this gap. When I was working on this sermon this week, coming back from Europe, I was sitting in an airport, and I found this little desk to plug my computer in, and it was right beside one of those people movers, you know, those escalators that if you're tired, you can kind of stand on, and it moves you a couple of feet along to the next gate. And there was this female robot saying, "Mind the gap, mind the gap. Mind the gap." And it was really annoying. And as I started really looking at the readings today, you know what? That is actually the message of the readings. It's the message of the readings, to mind the gap. And it's not so much a warning, perhaps, as a celebration of a new kind of thinking about faith and what religious wisdom might prove helpful in our own day. And it was interesting also being away from the country for a month, coming back this week to some of the latest images of high political corruption. And it's rather like going into an old photographic darkroom and the negatives are being developed and these images are coming up and we're picking them up and hanging them up to dry. And we're looking at all these images that are emerging. And what are they telling us? What images we see of ourselves in these new revelations? How do we live with the space between what we think we are as Americans and as Christians and what we really are? And in some ways, the attention on one person, the attention on our president, is also a kind of distraction about what that really says about us in this country, U.S., us. And so I've been thinking about that. And also the sad news this weekend that John McCain has passed away. And I was thinking about that this morning. You know, we will be burying more than John McCain's body this coming week. There is a sense in which, sacramentally, he represents a loss of who we were. And there is a gap. There is a political gap. There is a spiritual gap that these readings, it's almost like the readings spill out of the safety of our little church into the public square this week and help us as we mourn who we were. And what help can we get in this abiding in Jesus kind of image that are also part of our lectionary? And for some of us, we just can't reach that far, you know. I often get criticized for preaching politics. And, you know, I read the stories, these wonderful stories of Solomon. It's full of politics. And it's the ancient wisdom, and it's almost that people want to silo that religion is this kind of me and Jesus private walk. And the scriptures are not about that. It spills into everything. And there's a gap. It's interesting, the story of Solomon is also about somebody who, the whole idea of monarchy was something that the Israelites were not quite sure they wanted. They were a 12-tribe confederacy. And so he's come a long way from his peasant father king, David, and here he is in front of this glorious temple that took 7 years to build. And he, in 11 years of being the king, he has taken Israel from being this little nothing into this major international power. And he has forged alliances with all the neighboring countries, largely through marriages. He had this proclivity for beautiful foreign women. But he was able to secure a kind of peace and a prosperity that was unprecedented. And we think about the Psalms that we read today, the first 5 books of the Bible, there was glorious culture released because of his reign and what he produced. And it's interesting that he's standing in front of the temple, and again, I get this image of a people mover. He's created this people mover that includes everybody, all the foreigners. That Israel and Judaism is no longer this little tiny kind of religion. It's all about us. It's about everybody's welcome to the temple of Yahweh, and there's no God like Yahweh. And he's, although he is building this temple, he's building other temples to other gods, and he's a pragmatist. He's forging these international relations, and because of that, for 40 years, Israel has never known such prosperity. But again, it's on the backs of his people. He's enslaved some of his people, heavy taxation. And it's interesting that the consecration of the temple is actually the beginning of his demise. It's been too expensive. And he's had to use nefarious means to be able to do this. And back to that gap between monarchy and the tribal thing, they don't like it. And 10 of the tribes turn against him. And when he dies, his son inherits a civil war. You know, it didn't last. And history has been kind to, even though the people who attacked Solomon, they said that he was worshiping foreign gods and whoring after marrying these women from different countries, and the purity of Judaistic monotheism was watered down. That was a criticism, but his wisdom remains. And very interesting that even in the character of Solomon, there is a gap. in terms of how we feel about him. So back to this story in Capernaum where the disciples have a hard time. There is this gap in what they thought Jesus the Messiah, who was this miracle-working Moses figure, and all of a sudden he's talking about suffering and something else that they can't really abide. They can't go there. And I think about the church today and the different ways and with the expectations we have of the church. In some ways, the church is a kind of people mover as well. I think about the children that we're preparing for confirmation. There's a sense in which from their birth, they are brought here, they are carried lovingly on the people mover through baptism, supported all those years by their parents and their faith community, and then at some point, mind the gap, they have to take those first steps of faith themselves. They have to decide where they are going in their faith, and for many of them, it doesn't work, it doesn't fit. There is a kind of disconnect. They see the anger and the violence of the church. I mean, look at the reaction to Pope Francis in Ireland this week, right? The way in which the church has been so much a part of human problems and not able to admit that. And I can understand why kids want to get off the people mover. And a lot of us leave. There are times in my ministry where I've just wanted to walk away, right? That I see the gap between who we say we are and who we really are, right? It's a gap. And then sometimes someone will say, Albert, I'm having trouble in my marriage. Can you help us? Or baptize my child. And the people mover carries us along. And I live with that gap. I remember recently talking to a seminarian, and he's not from this diocese, but he was complaining that as he was going through the ordination process, his rector had retired, and he kind of fell through the cracks, and the diocese ignored him, and all the things that should have happened didn't happen. And I said to him, why are you surprised that the church let you down? The fact that you're still doing it is a sign that you're called to ministry. That's the gap, you know? And so the invitation is to see that gap actually not something that we should fill or bridge, but we can sort of live in it. Can we live in that gap? Because that's what it means to be people of faith. And I think that's why some of the disciples found it hard, because they didn't want that. They wanted something else. You know? So lots in the readings today as we look at our world. And I think a kind of, the image I have is of a 4-point compass. We have kind of 4 points to think about as we move forward in faith. And it's pointing us to the minding of the gap. And these stories and characters help us find inspiration in our own struggles and our own dis-ease within ourselves and our world. First of all, Solomon and his deal with God, wise and majestically fragile. Solomon mind the gap. Second, the Exodus people in the desert, hopeful and chronically dislocated and diseased, grumbling their way through the desert to a place of joy. Mind the gap. Jesus and his disciples, too far out, too weird, too idealistic, and so we keep searching for the place where we can be truly loved and truly at home. And you know, I look around as I think about preparing these children for confirmation, I look around and, you know, and I don't see any other institution that is loving me into the kind of person that I can become. I don't see that. So when the disciples are saying, Jesus, where else can we go? I hear that echoing through the centuries. Where else can we go? And finally, the church, oblivious to the pain it has caused and the potential to be the wounded, crucified healer and connector of the world, in all its privileged blindness. And a little voice saying, remember me. Remember me, abide in me. Eat this bread. Where else can we go? Look around. Where else? Where?